Hi everyone, it's Gavin J, the best thing since the river. And you're listening to the Therapy Suite right here on UK Health Radio, the world's number one talk health radio. This week I speak to Mark Vahrmeyer, who is a UKCP accredited psychotherapist from Brighton and Hove Psychotherapy. Welcome to the show, Mark. How are you doing?
Gavin, I'm very well, thanks. And thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. Sorry about that. I got a bit mixed up there with my wordings. It happens, unfortunately.
It's a mouthful, isn't
it? Look, thank you for your time. I think it's fantastic to get you on the show about such an interesting subject as well, about narcissism, narcissists. We hear so much about it in like social media, and I think sometimes people use the term quite loosely as well, if I'm going to be honest. But let's start with you. I think it'd be fantastic for you to just tell us a bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, very happy to, Gavin. So, as you quite rightly opened with, I'm a UKCP accredited psychotherapist. I've been a clinician now for nearly 15 years. I started my training in Australia and then carried on my training over here in the UK, specifically London. And I now have a practice in Brighton, down on the south coast, and in a town called Lewes, which is slightly inland in the South Downs National Park. Most of my work is what I call depth psychotherapy and long term. So when patients come and see me, they tend to be with me for quite a long period of time. It's not agreed up front, and many people don't really have a concept of psychotherapy when they first come to see me. But more often than not, people are with me for many, many months and often years. So I see people same time, same day, each week, in that very traditional sort of analytic framework, as we would call it in the field.
Fantastic. Let's start off with, what exactly is a narcissist?
A narcissist, it's a wonderful question, isn't it? And I think I'm almost tempted to say, well, it depends who's asking. And of course, that's not really an accurate answer, but it has become that way because there is such an enormous gulf between how a clinician like myself would think about narcissism and your question, what is a narcissist? And how it has been used in popular culture. So just to sort of preface answering the question, I don't think there is any other mental health term that I can think of anyway that has become so ubiquitous, so common in our daily language, as well as being so distorted. So it's become a real term of abuse out there, particularly in the world of social media. If I have a look at online bookstores, there's book after book about how to survive narcissism, is my partner a narcissist, and so forth. So it has this very, very negative connotation. And I think fundamentally what's happened is that the populace tends to confuse people's behaviors with what narcissism actually is. So if we to think about how people behave, all of us at times can behave in selfish, self-centered, thoughtless ways. Hopefully not all of the time, and hopefully not all of those together. But nonetheless, we're all capable of that. But that doesn't make us all narcissists. Unfortunately, what's happened is where people perhaps display this sort of behavior, out there, more and more people are now labeling them as, well, this is a narcissist, so relationship with them is possible. Well, actually, we know nothing at all of their personality structure. So coming back to your question, what is a narcissist? Well, in clinical terms, we use the word narcissism to describe a particular way that a person's personality is structured. So all of us have got personalities, and all of us have got personality traits. And some of us might have, let's say, more depressive traits. Some of us might have obsessive compulsive traits and so forth. And one of the main traits is narcissism. Now, we're all a mix, so it would be very difficult to find somebody who is purely one trait. So I think it's quite difficult to find somebody who is purely narcissistic. But nonetheless, if that is the dominant characteristic, and I as yet haven't explained exactly what that is, but if that is a dominant characteristic of their personality, then we would say, well, this person, in a clinical sense, has got a personality that has a narcissistic style to it, or a narcissistic structure. So what do we mean by that? Well, as a clinician, and myself and my colleagues would be less interested in the behavior that someone manifests. So as I said, someone being selfish or egocentric or whatever it might be, I'm more interested in what's going on underneath the surface. So all of our personality structures, the way we interact with the world and the way we have a relationship with ourselves, they are there in order to essentially manage and protect our vulnerability. So somebody who is narcissistic, I'll start with a sort of typical narcissistic person, expresses themselves outwardly as rather grandiose. They're not good at relating. In fact, they find relating very difficult. So it is essentially their way or the highway. They can come across as very entitled. They can think a lot about themselves. They can enjoy the sound of their own voice. Now, hopefully some of your listeners are thinking, oh, yeah, I know people who might be a little bit like that. But the critical bit for me as a clinician is what's going on underneath the surface. And all of these sorts of behaviors and the way they present themselves to the world, that's actually covering up a very, very fragile structure, a very fragile sense of self. So somebody who's got essentially low self-esteem, poor idea of who they really are, a poor ability to understand what they might be able to get in a healthy way from a relationship. And they're terrified of being vulnerable, and they're terrified of anyone getting too close to them, which is why they objectify people and keep people at a distance and see people as resources to use rather than operating in a world of mutuality. So does that give a little bit of a gist of how, as a clinician, we might think about it?
Yeah, which is I like that because it's quite nice and broad, because it's difficult sometimes to kind of narrow things down sometimes. I mean, the things I've heard in the past, and I've watched some documentaries on, I think there's been some descriptions of narcissists, like overinflated belief in themselves. Don't get me wrong. Let's not mix up with people believing themselves. People have to believe in themselves, you know, to go on and do well and be confident. But my understanding is with a narcissist is that there's an exaggerated belief in themselves, like way over the average, basically, and they maybe exaggerate about their achievements or possibly lie about their achievements as well. They've been described as very manipulative, and also being able to home in on people's like psychological weaknesses as well. Again, this is people I've spoken to, documentaries I've watched where there's been descriptions of stuff like that. So I'm not sure exactly how 100% that is correct, but that there's some of the things I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some of those things too, and I think there's a grain of truth to each and every one of those. I think what's really important to try and remember is that where we're talking about a dominant trait in a personality, we've got to think about it as being on a spectrum from very, very mild and someone who can largely function really quite well in the world, all the way through to what we might term as a personality disorder. And just a caveat around that, there is no clear definition really fundamentally what a personality disorder is. I mean, I know one if I come across one, but another clinician might put the sort of boundary of where that sits in a slightly different position. So again, it's less about what we notice in someone and more about how much they suffer. So someone who's got a really rigid narcissistic personality probably encompasses many of the traits you just talked about and may well be quite manipulative. They're likely to think quite highly of themselves. They're likely to exaggerate their achievements. All that's very common. And of course, under that, what they're doing is protecting against what they see as a shameful inadequacy. The reality is, for the vast majority of people with this sort of personality style, is they're not inadequate at all. They're just ordinary human beings like you and me. But they can't tolerate that. They can't tolerate ordinariness, and they feel deeply ashamed of any mistakes, any inadequacies, any vulnerabilities. So that's constantly what's going on underneath the surface. I quite like to use analogies. So maybe an analogy to use in thinking about this is, I absolutely agree with you, Gavin, that we need to have a good sense of who we are, and we need to have solid self-esteem, and we need to, want to put our needs out into the world. That's how we operate in a healthy society. But if we think about a house, so representing a human psyche, narcissists need scaffolding around the house to hold it up. And the scaffolding is constant external validation. I drive the right car. I've got the right friends. I eat in the right restaurants. I've got the right amount of money in my bank account. All of that is external scaffolding. Whereas the rest of us might like a bit more money, or we might like to have a broader friendship circle. But it's not catastrophic to our sense of self if we don't get those things.
Absolutely. I think I've heard some really interesting, some varied things on topics as well. Because I remember watching a few documentaries, and it was mentioned that sometimes some narcissists exist on a very authoritative level, like boss level, basically, whether it's in a business or work or whatever it might be. And it's talking generally about personality disorder. I've done some reading in the past, and what it mentions is that this is broadly saying someone with a personality disorder finds it difficult to learn and develop, and so they use the same kind of methods and routines as they've developed maybe when they were younger, and they use the same thing again and again and again, and they find it difficult to learn and develop as a person. My understanding is something along those lines. Have you heard of something like that similar? Or?
Yeah, you've obviously done your research, because I think it's also a very empathic way of putting it, really, isn't it? Because how you're starting to take the conversation is into, well, if somebody with quite a rigid narcissistic personality, and actually this applies to all personalities, but let's stay with narcissism, finds it difficult to change, they find it difficult to learn from experience, and they find it difficult to learn from relationship, well, that then opens the door to us thinking, gosh, that actually isn't a very easy way to go through life, is it? Because, I'm middle-aged, I'm in my late 40s, and I like to think that I learn from every interaction I have with people. And I'm constantly thinking about, how can I improve? How can I do better?
Absolutely.
How can I be a better clinician?
Exactly same thing with me.
So that there's a certain humility in there that we can use to our healthy advantage. But someone who's narcissistic, again, it sort of goes right back to childhood. That if we think about where does our personality develop? Well, largely our personality is laid down in the first couple of years of life. And who do we spend our time with in those first couple of years of life? Well, by and large, it's our primary carers. So we focus on the relationship that happens between that infant and his or her parents. And there's a particular type of relating that unfolds from parent to child that lays down this narcissistic structure. So one way of perhaps thinking about narcissistic personality in its more extreme forms, as well as other personality disorders, is that they're a type of developmental arrest. That person is stuck psychologically at really quite a young age. And for narcissists, that age it's probably about 2 years old, maybe slightly earlier than 2 years old. And 2 years old, if we think about toddlers, either anyone who's got a toddler has had one or knows of toddlers are like little dictators. They want what they want. They throw tantrums when they don't get what they want.
Absolutely. I know. I've had nieces and nephews, etc. And so, yeah, it's they just, because they're just still learning, aren't they?
They're learning, and do you know what else they're learning is they don't yet have the capacity to think about someone else's needs. Yeah. So, as you and I are talking now, if I start to behave outrageously, that's going to upset you, frustrate you, irritate you. Well, I'm a socialized person. Of course, I'm not going to do that, because I would be thinking, oh, gosh, this isn't very fair on Gavin, is it? But a toddler doesn't do that. A toddler wakes up and demands what they demand at whatever time they demand it. And so should they, because they're toddlers. And there's part of that healthy process of development that toddler has to come to terms with the fact that, oh, the world isn't there to meet all of my needs. That's really frustrating. But do you know what? On balance, I can still make my way in the world. I might have to negotiate a bit more. I might have to think about other people, but I can make my way in the world, and I can build something, i.e. a life that's worth living. Narcissists don't view the world that way. They view the world from the perspective that, right, the world's out to get me, and so I'm going to make sure I get what I want from the world.
Mm-hmm. We're just going to a quick ad break, and we'll be right back.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
So, Mark, that was brilliant. Thank you for that description of, what a narcissist is. And why do you think it's becoming more of an increasing issue, like with narcissists and hearing more about it and that kind of thing?
I almost think that's like the $1 million question. So I've been wondering about that. And as a clinician, it comes up more and more in my practice. It doesn't come up with people presenting with narcissism, because this is another issue that, we get people presenting in psychotherapy with anxiety, for example, or depression. So people know if they feel anxious. People know if they're depressed. People don't know if they've got a narcissistic personality. Other people know quite often, but they don't know, because their whole way of operating in the world is to keep any sense of who they really are, because they're ashamed of that, to keep it at bay, to keep it buried. So more and more over the years, I've been hearing and understanding about people's relationships where there's perhaps narcissism at play, or what looks like narcissism. Practically a day doesn't go by where there isn't something on social media or a book published about narcissism. I've also got a book in the pipeline about narcissism. So there's a huge interest in this. And I suppose the question is, well, why is that? Is this a new phenomenon? Were people not previously narcissistic? Well, we know that's not true, because the word itself comes from narcissus, which is from the Greek myth. I won't bore everybody going into sort of a huge detail about this, but it's interesting if we think that, well, 2,000 years ago, a gentleman called Ovid wrote a Greek myth about Narcissus and Echo. And Narcissus, some people may have heard of this myth. Some people may be familiar with the image of Narcissus staring into his reflection in the pool as though he's in love with it. Well, he's not actually in love with it. He's avoiding relationship, i.e. the only relationship that he can possibly have is with his own reflection, because his own reflection he chooses to see as perfect, and his own reflection doesn't demand anything from him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Sorry, I'm just thinking about it. It just sounds really interesting. This is the wrong time for me to start reflecting. There's a show going on. No, thank you very much for that, Mark. I think that makes a lot of sense, I mean, okay. How can someone tell if they are in a relationship with a narcissist, and what can they do about it if it's becoming problematic?
Yeah, well, let's combine that question with the last one. And if your listeners can take anything away from today, I would really urge them to almost forget about narcissism, which might sound counterintuitive because we're having an in-depth conversation about it. But here's the rub. If somebody gives me a set of behaviors about someone's, how someone is being with them, I cannot tell that person that the other is narcissistic. It's not possible. The only way I can work out if someone's got a narcissistic personality style is through usually quite a lengthy period of time of me relating to them in a clinical sense. It comes to light. So your listeners, are they going to be able to work out if someone is narcissistic? Probably not, but that's not the thing that matters the most. I think there's a simpler way of thinking about this. And the way I like to think about it, and I use this with my patients as well, is look, what you can work out from a felt sense is whether you are in a relationship with two people or one person. And often people look at me slightly strange and say, well, there's two people there. No. Let's think about what's going on in the relationship. How do you feel when you're interacting with this person? Well, now you mention it, they say, it doesn't feel like I'm really there, or they're not listening to me, or they're just talking over me, or they're just interested in making their own points. Okay, what does that feel like? Well, yeah, it doesn't feel very alive. I feel a bit annoyed. I feel bored. Doesn't feel like there's really anything in it for me. Yeah, well, that's a one-person relationship. So whether or not that person, that other person who's behaving that way towards you, has clinically got a narcissistic personality is sort of academic. They might have, or they might not have. But what is clear is that this way of relating doesn't work for you. Human beings, we are completely constructed by relationship. From the moment we are conceived in utero, we're in relationship with our mother. We're born. We can't survive without relationship. We are dependent on our primary carers for longer than any other animal. And we seek out relationship. It's how we operate in the world. And most of us, we interact, we listen to what the other person needs, we put our needs into the mix. There's a bit of jostling, a bit of communication, negotiation, working out, and that's how we move forward in life. In other words, we don't set out to annihilate everybody who crosses our path. So people who are in relationship with someone who, let's say, primarily does one-person relationships, they're not going to be interested. So if you and I were in a social setting, I might be saying, well, go on, Gavin, tell me about your family. What did you do at the weekend, Oh, that's really interesting. I went there too. Did you notice this about it? There would be a to and fro between us, and we'd be finding things that were of mutual interest. Or you might tell me about something I don't know, and then I'd say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Tell me some more." For example, somebody who's narcissistic isn't going to operate that way. They're going to be telling you what they think. They're going to be telling you about the world. They're going to be wanting you to become the pool that reflects back Narcissist's reflection. Does that make some sense?
Yeah,
so one of the primary things that somebody who's got this narcissistic structure cannot tolerate is difference. So if you and I spent long enough talking, I'm sure we'd find things we disagree on, whether that's football teams or musical taste or politics or whatever it is. And I would hope if we went there that you could make your case and I'd do, all right, that's really interesting. I'd make my case and then we'd talk about it a bit more and move on. Someone who's narcissistic can't tolerate you having a different opinion to them. They can't tolerate you having a different perspective or worldview. There only can ever be one person who is right, and it's either them or you. And so mostly then, narcissists are going to make sure it's them. Now, I put the word mostly in there, and I just want to pick one thing up, which is quite important. There is a second type of person who has a narcissistic personality, and they present quite differently. Us clinicians often make the mistake of thinking they're depressed. So they can seem quite down. They lament life. They tend to think outwardly quite poorly of themselves. I'm never not much of an achiever. I've never managed to get where I should be. But if you get beneath the surface and work out what's going on in their inner world, they are absolutely enraged that the world has dealt them this bad hand. They believe that they should have much more than they have. Everybody else has made it difficult for them to get where they are. So this is what we call a deflated narcissist. It's the flip side of the narcissistic personality. Instead of being grandiose outwardly and very, very deflated inwardly, they're deflated outwardly, and inwardly there's this little tyrant who's just waiting for an opportunity and blames the world for never having become what they should have become. Whereas someone who's depressed isn't filled with rage. They're just depressed.
Absolutely. Gosh, yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, have you spoken to people that have been in relationships with narcissists at all?
Yes, I would argue. I think there's something very interesting about this. I would say most people who cross my threshold as patients have had parents who, to a greater or lesser degree, have been narcissistic. So what happens then if we've had parents who are narcissistic? We learn that we can't put our own needs into the mix. We can't express ourselves freely. We can't have our own emotions. We can't have our own thoughts and feelings. And instead, we work out, right, who does my parent want me to be? That's who I'm going to be. Now, it might sound like a sort of rather odd solution to this, but if you think about a child's experience, and this is in fact true of all mammals, their primary objective is safety. So therefore, at all costs, they hold on to the relationship with their parents. So if they realize that their parent shows displeasure when they are themselves, or they're too much or too little in some way, that child will adapt and become what the parent wants them to be. So that lays down already somewhat of a structure. And unfortunately, quite often children who have had narcissistic parents will seek out partners who are narcissistic because the past has a habit of repeating itself unless it's been worked through, which is obviously what we try and do in therapy. So yes, I've worked with people whose partners certainly in a non-clinical sense could only operate in a one-person world rather than a two-person world, all the way through to what was quite clearly really quite serious narcissistic pathology. And those patients tried everything they could and realized the only option to save themselves was to get out of those relationships. And of course, that's very hard to do because narcissists don't like you doing what they don't want you to do.
No. I've heard about that as well. So that basically, where someone may have had either one parent that's a narcissist or both parents that are narcissists, have grown up with that kind of relationship. So they, unfortunately, it sounds like they normalize it. So then they seek out partners with similar traits. Is that kind of where we're going with this?
Yeah, you're putting it in really good terms. You know, if we very, very briefly return to the Greek myth and imagine this as a spectrum. On the one side, you've got narcissists who can only see his own reflection and can't see anyone else. But there was another character in the myth called Echo. And this has given us the word for echo now, as an echo chamber. So Echo, her voice was taken away as punishment by one of the gods, and she fell in love with Narcissus. And she essentially gave up her life just staring at him. She tried to have a relationship with him. He pushed her away, and she spent the rest of her life pining for him. The second part of Echo's story is her voice was taken away, but all she could do was echo back the last words that anyone said. So you've got these two extremes, and very narcissistic people attract echoists. So in other words, they attract people who are just going to repeat back to them what they've said. In other words, to tell them how great they are, not put any of their needs into the mix, and just be there as an echo chamber for them. So children of narcissists either become quite narcissistic themselves, or they become what we might call, it's not a clinical term, but for simplicity, let's say, we might call them echoists. So in other words, they don't really know who they are either. They're not very in touch with their needs. They don't have clear boundaries. They're not assertive. And so they'll pick out someone who looks very assertive, who knows exactly what they want and has got a very strong sense of self, at least outwardly, which of course is narcissists, the archetypes in narcissistic people.
No, of course. At that point, we're just going to a quick ad break and we'll be right back.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Thanks for that, Mark. Very, very interesting. I find this subject so interesting because I hear about it over the years, and and I know it comes up in social media as well and that kind of thing. So I think it's brilliant we're doing a show about it just to, go through a bit more, get some information which is more accurate in terms of narcissists. What sort of people are attracted to narcissists? Let's say, for example, you have the person which hasn't grown up with narcissistic parents, and they go, normal everyday life. Do you know what kind of attracts people to narcissists at all?
I think, to be honest, Gavin, I think we're all attracted to them on some level. They can be very attractive. And what do I mean by that? Well, these are people who, certainly in the grandiose form, and certainly when they're more out there in the public world, they can look like they've got all the answers. They can look like they're absolutely self-assured. They can look like people who are winners. And, I'm sure we'll touch on this shortly, but there's this idea that narcissists are winners. Imagine there's a fantasy. Imagine you could go through life, not worry about anyone else's feelings, treat everyone as a commodity and get ahead. Probably for a small part of us, if we're completely honest, that sounds quite appealing. Of course, when we start to think it through how lonely it would be, it's not appealing at all. But for a small part of us, I think it's very appealing. So most of us like to what degree we do it is obviously variable. Most of us are interested in celebrities. Most of us follow someone on social media. Most of us are interested in the rich and famous and how they live their lives. There's a very, very well-known series that has been on recently that comes up quite a lot in my clinical work called Succession, where the lives of the rich and famous play out in a very narcissistic way. So I think most of us are drawn to this, but what's also interesting is I think we also take secret pleasure in their downfall. So when people who we've seen as having it all suddenly fall off their pedestal, if we're honest, I think there's a part of us that takes a certain amount of pleasure in that. And that's true of all of us. We've all got these feelings that we find uncomfortable to own up to. Maybe what's changed, though, in exponentially in recent years, is how the platforms are there that provide a voice to people who've got these more narcissistic ways of being. We only need to go back let's say 20, 30 years. And what were there, 4 or 5 channels of television in this country?
Yep.
You know, most people now have got multiple channels. They've got streaming, they watch YouTube, they watch all sorts of different platforms. So it's far easier for people now to broadcast their message out into the world. I'm broadcasting my message with your assistance out into the world, hopefully not in a negatively narcissistic way. But nonetheless, you know, you are affording me a platform. So I think there's far more of these platforms out there. And there are probably quite a lot of social factors playing into this as well. If we like, these sort of vicissitudes of modern life, where I think some of these narcissistic ways of being are coming more to light. So, you know, it's a complex topic, and without sort of getting too bogged down in it, the traditional pillars that gave us meaning, structure, purpose, and direction in life, in culture and in society, including religion, have largely been deconstructed. Now, not for me to say if that's a good or bad thing. In lots of ways, it probably is a good thing, you know, from a social and a class perspective. However, we haven't really put much collective in its place to replace it with. So I think a lot of people out there are searching for meaning. They're searching for a sense of, well, who am I, first of all? What's my identity? What's my belonging? What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Dutch or French or whatever it is? What does it then mean to be part of this family? When families used to all live in the same town or village, and now, you know, a lot of families are, in fact, most families don't live in the same town or village. So there's this sort of dispersion of families across the country. The idea of the nuclear family doesn't really hold water in the same way it once did, you know, so it's far more common to have these different types of blended families or single parents and so forth. And again, let's be really clear. I'm not being judgmental, and I'm not saying, well, all this is morally wrong. It's not about morals. But if these were traditional pillars that gave us a sense of meaning, structure, purpose, and those have been taken away, then it brings rise to anxiety, I think, in many of us of, well, what's my purpose? Who am I? Where do I belong? And I think there's quite a lot of noise coming from the media, from social media, with people who profess to have the answers to, well, this is how you should live your life. This is what it means to be a man. We get a lot of that at the moment from certain media influencers, or, you know, particular tribes evolve. You know, we see that quite a lot at the moment with some of the environmental movements. Again, it's not about whether environmental movements are inherently good or bad. I think they're probably good, but there are quite powerful little tribal communities evolving, which I think give people psychologically a sense of purpose and belonging. Again, nothing wrong with that, but we used to have it collectively, and now it's very disparate. So a long answer to, I think, is a combination of, there are more people having a platform, so they're able to reach us with their voices, and the people who tend to rise to the top in those sorts of places and shout the loudest are people with a more narcissistic message to give. And then secondly, I think in the collective, there's more a sense of, I'm not really sure who I am. I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I'm not 100% sure what I believe in. Is it okay to be a man? Is it okay to be masculine? I'm not really sure. How am I supposed to be a man? And the same for women. And, you know, I think there's a lot of confusion out there and a lot of lack of direction. And somebody like me, who's obviously, you know, a clinician working in the field of applied psychology, I've got nothing that I can say on TikTok that is going to compete with influencers who are giving people the answers to life in a 2-minute video, because my message is rather boring. It's, well, I don't have an answer for your life in 2 minutes, but come and sit with me and we can work out what might work for you. But that might take quite a lot of time. And fundamentally, I believe, and I've alluded to this earlier on, that relationships are the key to our sense of meaning, purpose, and contentment. So I tend to focus on, how do we live an ordinary life which is populated by meaningful activities, but also relationships based on mutuality and love, rather than adoration, which is, you know, it's the equivalent of, well, how many followers can I get on TikTok, and that says something about me as a human being. I don't think it says anything about anyone as a human being, apart from the fact maybe you're quite good at TikTok, you know.
Basically, have you known a narcissist yourself, right? Or come across someone and you've known them and you're like, you know what, I just really feel that you're a narcissist. I'm not going to tell you that, but maybe socially or friends or relationships, have you been in contact with narcissists before?
Yeah, I absolutely have. I mean, it's fair to say my father was quite far along on the narcissistic spectrum. So I grew up being told who I was supposed to be. That's very different to being told what boundaries are and, behavior. I was literally told, this is your purpose. If I didn't live up to the purpose, I was told, what use are you to me? Well, rather the question, what use are you to me? So I grew up with a very narcissistic father. And, as a result, perhaps, I've gone through many, many years of therapy and found my meaning, purpose, and I'm able to make healthy choices when it comes to friends. But I did have a good friend for many years who very close, and he just ditched me when I was of no use to him whatsoever for about 5 years. And then remarkably just popped up again on the scene after 5 years as though nothing had happened. I was quite taken aback, but I agreed to meet with him and we met up and I sat there through lunch and I've never felt so bored. And it was at that point I realized, of course, there's nothing in this for me. It's all about you. You don't actually want to meet with me. You just want whatever was going on in his life. You want this particular reflective pool back in your life. Well, I'm out. So after that lunch, I said, I'm very sorry, but this isn't going to work for me. So I won't be meeting up with you again. So that's the other thing in this, which is, it's hard to let go of old friendships, but I think it's contingent on us looking after ourselves and thinking about, well, being in relationship with this person, is it good for me? Does it benefit me? How do I feel when I'm with them? Do I feel like they're interested in me? Do I feel like they care about me? Can I lean on them when I'm having some difficulties? And if the answer to all of those is yes, then that's probably a relationship based, what I would call love in the broadest sense of the word. But if you're spending time with someone who actually they're not really interested in you at all, unless you're mirroring back what they want to hear, and they'll drop you at a moment's notice and pick you up if they need you again, I would question, and I do this virtually every day in my clinical work, I'd question, well, what's in it for you ultimately, and is this really benefiting you?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. Really appreciate that. Can a narcissist get help at all through psychotherapy or couples or any other way, basically?
Yeah. Well, let's start at the most basic level. And I don't mean basic necessarily and simple, but perhaps the most basic and important level for your listeners. If anyone finds themselves in a relationship where they might be thinking, I think this person might be narcissistic. Well, I said earlier, see if you can drop the label and instead ask the question, right, I think I might be in a relationship with someone who can only do one-person relationships. Let me see whether they're capable of a two-person relationship. Start putting your needs in the mix. Start talking about yourself more. And if your friend or partner or colleague or whomever it might be doesn't start to get curious about you, doesn't hold you in mind, doesn't show empathy, then you're getting the answer to your question. So that's the first thing, which I think we can all do, which is, hang on a minute, I'm not here to be echo. I've also got needs. I'm going to talk about something I'd like to talk about and see if that person is willing to be curious about my life. That's the baseline. I also suggested earlier that it's very rare for people with a more developed narcissistic personality to come to therapy, because why would they? There's nothing wrong with them. It's the rest of the world that's the problem. However, they do sometimes come. If they come, it's in middle age, where perhaps they've had quite a few relationships and they've started to spot a painful pattern, which is, actually, I don't really have any relationships where there's a sense of depth and longevity to them, and I feel quite lonely and my marriage has failed or whatever it might be. So they might well come to therapy presenting with depression. Can they be helped? Possibly. My job as a therapist is to have a relationship with my patients, and each patient I have a different relationship with. And one of the adages as well, it's not a real relationship because people pay for therapy. Well, they're paying for time in my diary, but they're not paying for what happens in the room, and they're not paying for the relationship we have. So I've worked with people who have had what was clinically, in my view, a narcissistic structure, and the work has been to try and get beneath that into that real vulnerability, which that person is terribly, terribly defended against. See if they can start to talk about their inner world, their fears, how ashamed they feel, how inadequate they feel. If you can get to that and that can be therapeutically held and explored, then there is hope that that person might be able to use therapy and subsequently start to relate a little bit differently in the world. So it's not hopeless. There is a clinical way that we can make sense of this, which may be of interest. Fundamentally, it's sort of like a formula. The more narcissism is combined with an antisocial personality structure, the less hope there is of helping that person. So you mentioned something earlier, Gavin, which I thought was interesting when you were talking about these different traits of sort of narcissistic people, and you used the word manipulative at one point. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah,
that.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we often experience that sort of more the darker levels of manipulation with people who have got perhaps what we might colloquially term as a malignant narcissistic personality, so malignant narcissism, and those sorts of people have got an unfortunate combination of narcissism with antisocial personality, and really they take a degree of pleasure from manipulating people, from hurting people, from stepping on people, and it's extremely difficult to help those kinds of people because, first of all, they don't present for therapy, and if they do, all they want you to do is help them get back to the old modus operandi of being in the world. So it's on this spectrum. The more serious and the more rigid the personality is, and combined with antisocial style or what we might call sadism as well, it becomes very, very difficult to help that sort of person. And, believe you me, that most people, as you sort of travel along this spectrum of narcissism, it's not an easy life, despite the idea that narcissists might be winners and outwardly some narcissists are very talented. They're, brilliant musicians, or they're excellent in business. But to walk around day in, day out with this core that is utterly fragile, where there's a sense of inadequacy, where there's a sense of, I'm not really lovable and I need to cover that up constantly. I mean, that's an awful way to live life. And to not be able to trust in love that somebody wants to be with you because they like you, not because of what you can do for them. It's a very, very lonely existence, despite what it looked like. The glitzy cars and glamour aside, I wouldn't trade having a reasonably functioning personality and way of being social in the world with that for any money.
No, of course, it's not the best way to exist, isn't it? It's nice to have genuine relationships as well with people. And that means you've got to give yourself away, isn't it? You've got to, and it's being in a relationship, whether it's friends or family or partner, whoever it is, you've got to be yourself and give yourself some of yourself away. And you kind of get that back, don't you?
You hope you do.
You hope you do. Absolutely. But if you can't do that, and you're the way you carry yourself is as this person as this other person, or you put like a screen in front of you, in terms of, kind of just hiding your inner self, you're going to get into relationships which are not sincere. They're not actually, they don't connect with you, if that makes sense, because you're giving off this falseness about you, not giving yourself away. So basically, people that react to that or are attracted to that is not actually what connects with you internally, if that makes sense.
I think you've put it so well. I couldn't have put it any better. That's exactly what it is. You're presenting. There's a lovely clinician in the war called Winnicott. He came up with this term, the false self. You're presenting a false self to the world, and unfortunately, that's it. And the only people you're going to have a relationship with are the ones who will hold up a mirror and reflect back that false self. But you never feel seen. You never really feel connected with, and nor does the person you're with. That's back to those two archetypes, Echo and Narcissus, in this symbiotic relationship, rather than real people. But, it sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, the way you beautifully put it, if you've got to give of yourself, but that's scary. When we meet someone new, I mean, most of us don't really think about it, but I can guarantee if you check someone's pulse level, meeting someone new, particularly if it's a friend of someone who matters or a relation of a friend that matters to us or whatever it might be, if there's something invested in it, our pulse rate goes up because we don't know what we're going to get. So we take a risk. Hello, this is me. And we wait. And we hope that they reciprocate with a bit of vulnerability. And that's how you build a real relationship, isn't it? You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mark, it's been fantastic talking to you. I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show. A lot of very interesting, information there. You mentioned you've got a book going to come out. Is that right?
Yeah, the hopefully is a book in the pipeline. The publisher has pushed it back, but the book title is Therapists Thinking About Narcissism. So again, it's a lot of what we've talked about, which is trying to dispel some of these myths and recognize that actually to have a narcissistic personality structure it's a developmental arrest, and it's a really difficult way to go through life. And if your listeners can come out of this with two things, one is forget about the term so much and think about the question: is this a one-person or a two-person relationship? Hold on to that. I think that could be very useful, fundamentally for them going forward. And drop a little bit about the narcissism. But the second thing is, when we do encounter someone who's got this one-person world way of relating, to have empathy. And empathy doesn't mean, oh, well, we better have a relationship with them and let them off the hook. This friend I had to eventually cut off, I have a lot of empathy for him. I just can't be in friendship with him because he's incapable.
No, and that's fair enough. If people wish to find you on social media or they want to seek your services, do please let us know where we can, get that information from.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. My website is brightonandhovepsychotherapy.com. I'm quite active on Twitter under the handle Brighton Psych, but I'll give you all the information.
Brilliant. Mark, thanks again for your time. Much appreciate it.
Gavin, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners. You can find me on Instagram at GavinJ417. Until next time, take care.